All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because it looks like a storm brewing. There's some really black clouds out there that look sort of threatening. So we'll go ahead and get started. But the museum will be open until 5 o'clock after we finish here if you want to go up and see the exhibit in the house, okay? I also want to remind you that our next program is August the 13th. It's Colonial Day. And most of the people on this side of the room will be working Colonial Day. So get used to their faces. I want to introduce you to the board members who are here. They're very supportive of our programming. We have our president, Judy Ferris. Just raise your hand, Judy. Okay. Our let's see, vice treasurer and corresponding secretary is Ellen Craig. Right, okay. And then one of our newest members is here. It's Reverend Darnell. That's right, okay. So thank you guys for being here. Oh, and we also have Cynthia Hicks back there, our past president, yeah. And our treasurer, if you have any money you'd like to give him today for the museum, he's right beside of her, so feel free. I want to get started with introducing Rob Merryman. For some reason, I've been wanting to call him this past week Rob Campbell, and it's because he lives in Campbell County and is very active in the Campbell County Historical Society. So we're real delighted to have him here. Rob has a BA degree in psychology from Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, and also an MSW degree in social work administration from Virginia Commonwealth University. He served in Vietnam, so we thank you for your service, Rob, and he held the rank of major in the reserves. He joined the staff of the Lynchburg Training School and Hospital in 1972 and retired 30 years later. So he is going to share with us the happenings at the colony, looking at the social, economic, and political trends that influenced the colony and its growth. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and
thank you.
And we'll hold some questions and answers when he finishes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, I appreciate inviting me, especially thank Peggy for letting me know about the program here. I'm going to speak partly from notes and just partly from other activities. And if I'm not loud enough, let me know back there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll shout. When I talk about the training center, I'm not just talking about the facility, the buildings, the real estate. I'm talking about the activities and the programs that were going on there. The training center was in existence for about 100 years. When I came there in 1972, it had already been in effect for about 70 or 80 years, and a lot had been taking place. When I came there, a lot of changes were beginning to occur, and a lot of them very, very controversial. And the training center became a controversial place as time wore on. But the purpose of me being here is to say that what took place at the training center reflected what was going on across the entire United States and many times in Europe. The training center was chartered in 1906 by the Virginia General Assembly. It was for white epileptics who were living at Western State Hospital in Stanton, and they were running out of room. They also got the notion that epileptics maybe shouldn't be mixed in with mentally ill or really seriously ill people, that they should be in a different environment. And so in 1906, the General Assembly submitted the following bill to establish an epileptic colony on the land of Western State Hospital in Amherst County. Western State owned that land. It had been donated by Stedney Merklin because his son had been treated at Stanton, had been treated kindly. The existing state hospitals for the white, insane, are near taxed to their fullest capacity and would be insufficient in the near future for the care of all such unfortunate persons. There are in said hospitals about 250 patients suffering from epilepsy. There is a probability of improvement in cures under special hygienic surroundings, congenial employment, and scientific and medical treatment, which may be available at a separate colony. That be it enacted by the General Assembly that the Board of Directors of Western State are authorized and directed to erect on the tract of land in Amherst County opposite the city of Lynchburg by the will of Sidney R. Merklin. There's a map over there. As you look, you can see exactly where that tract of land was. It was owned by Western State Hospital, who had bought it, or it was donated from Merklin, who lived on a place called the Morrisana. One of the boats that was built at the training center, we built a bateau back during that era, and it was called the Morrisana. And I've spent many a trip down the James River on the boat that was named after the plantation. The institution opened in 1911, so it took that amount of time to get the buildings constructed, and since that time, the training center or the colony has been part of Amherst County history. The history, a lot of people think of Lynchburg as an isolated entity, but like I said earlier, and I'll do a lot of repetition, it reflected what was going on in the entire United States. There were changes occurring over time. These changes were economic, they were medical changes, legal changes, technology, politics, and even the naming, the nomenclature. Over the years, literally thousands upon thousands of people passed through the colony, both as patient or as employees, and the many reasons that they were there were for epilepsy, or mainly during that period of time for eugenic reasons. Eugenics is an awkward, difficult term, but that was what the training center was about during the 20s and the 30s on up to the 70s, for eugenic reasons. And that was basically for sterilization. Many, many groups of people, not just epileptics, it was believed that their conditions could be passed on in a hereditary fashion. And so from the day that it opened, they were practicing sterilization. It was going on at Western State pretty much at the time, and it continued. But it was, at that particular time, not to trivialize it, it was no big deal because of the attitudes of society at that time. The people that came there under many different names. They were called epileptics, they were called morons, they were called imbeciles, feeble-minded, idiots, low-grade, high-grade, profound, mild, and moderately retarded. And these terms today are politically incorrect, if not repugnant. But at one time, they were scientifically and socially accepted. We come to the point today where we call it a person with developmental disability. The original colony was a therapeutic environment with fresh air, open spaces, exercise, a good diet, good nutrition. That's was important for people who had disabilities in those days, but in reality that was really about all they could do, because we did not have medical knowledge of what was going on with epilepsy. As we all know, medication came along there, and that was pretty much eliminated from the reason for admission to the training center. Eventually, it became a treatment center for those individuals there who were just not considered part of society. Some of them came there for very real medical needs, but a lot of individuals came there because of the community could not deal with them or did not want them. Truants, alcoholics, ladies of ill repute, the list goes on of the different conditions that they came there. Another source for the colony was, at that time, the counties, the localities, Amherst and Campbell County being two examples, were strapped for money, and every county had a poorhouse. And the supervisors were very concerned that the indigent people there who went to the poorhouses were taking up a lot of the county money. And so when they opened the training center, a lot of the supervisors said, aha, this is where these folks can go. Some of them just left, but a lot of them went from the poorhouses to the training center. Now, why were they in the poorhouse to begin with? They were in the poorhouse because they lost the farm. Either they had bad luck or they didn't have good management skills to survive. And so they went at the poorhouse. So many of the individuals went there. And of course, at the poorhouse, that was an agricultural type of activity. They had farms and stuff. And so they carried with them the skills and the activities there. How bad off were they? They probably weren't PhDs or anything like that, but they were individuals who just couldn't make it in society and who did not have other family resources to fall back on. In the 1920s, guess what? All the poorhouses closed. I had some family that used to run the poor farm in Campbell County, and so I learned a lot of the history of what happened there. But what happened was the county officials, they were just happy as they could be to get rid of the poor farm because they had to pay for that out of county funds. It did not get state support. And so when the state established these hospitals, they thought there's some people here that really need to go to the state hospitals. And so that happened very quickly. That had occurred in the 20s on up until the 30s. This went on up until about World War I, and a lot of people don't believe this, but during World War I, a lot of the men from the training center were drafted. They were drafted, and they fought in World War I. And you think for a minute, that has a chilling similarity to Project 1000 during the Vietnam War, if any of you know what that project was, where they got people with low abilities there and basically drafted them in Vietnam. They had a terrible casualty rate. But at any rate, it had a chilling similarity there. And so when they went to World War I, a lot of men were cannon fodder. And that's probably what happened. A lot of them did come home from World War I, and guess what? They went right back to the training center. I reviewed quite a few records of people who were admitted, or in many cases readmitted, because they'd been gassed, and their disability was they couldn't breathe anymore because they had lung problems. And that's sort of a hidden part of the history. But they returned to a setting where it was very agricultural. It was a self-sustaining entity in itself. It was a farm. They grew their own crops. They had their own vegetables. They prepared their own food because there were individuals there that were capable of doing that at that time. And again, you kind of ask yourself, well, what were they doing there to begin with? They came on hard luck, and they were there to be sterilized. Typically, or supposedly, when a person came there to be sterilized, they would be discharged right after that process. I talked to an individual from Fishersville, not to fast forward, but who was drafted into World War II, and he came to the training center because of truancy. He ran away from home. Every time the social services took him back home, his father beat the living daylights out of him, and so he ran away from home repeatedly, and he wound up in the training center. When the draft board came knocking on his door, he said, "Oh, ha, you can't draft me because I've been sterilized." And he said, "That's not a problem." And so I interviewed quite a few individuals during a lot of the controversy who had, in fact, been serving in the military. Some of them, one individual won the Bronze Star, and he was a former patient of the colony. I'm going to go back and forth. During the sterilization process, some of the doctors began to be concerned that they may be exposing themselves to legal liability. Suppose one of these individuals came back and sued them. Even back in those days, doctors were concerned about legal liability. And so Virginia General Assembly wanted to accommodate, and they passed the sterilization law in 1924, the Virginia sterilization law. It had been going on, but that made it official, and that the doctors thought that that would protect them. The doctors were still concerned, and so there was a doctor, Dr. Bell, who had a woman who came to the facility. She was not significantly retarded, but she was what we would say slow. And the reason she came there was because she had a child out of wedlock. And that was enough reason for her to come there. And by having a child out of wedlock, that was cause for her to be sterilized. He was a little bit concerned about this, and so he followed that case. The child that was born out of that situation there, her daughter, she acted very normal. And they thought, well, but she was still at the colony. And if you were born at the colony, you inherited the same status that your parent had. But they thought they were going to be humanistically, so they placed her in Charlottesville with the family as sort of a domestic servant. And while there, one of the sons of that family there raped her. And of course, back in those times, and even today, it was her fault. And so she was sent back to the training center, and where she had a child at the training center. And the child later on, just kind of fast forward with that, she went back to Charlottesville. The family took that child back, who was the daughter of their son, and she was enrolled in Charlottesville schools, and she was making an honor roll. Now, these are grandmother, mother, and granddaughter. This is what Oliver Wendell Holmes, a Supreme Court justice, used. You've all heard the term, 3 generations of imbeciles were enough. Well, they weren't imbeciles. They were just down on their luck individuals there that we would probably today say at least one of them was mild, maybe moderately retarded. But what that Supreme Court case did was that Dr. Bell was worried that the Virginia laws would not be enough protection. And so they decided, let's go for broke. They kicked it up to the Supreme Court. And given the climate of that time, the social and moral climate at that time, eugenics was a very popular thing. It was very, very well accepted in their society. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the most respected jurist of basically all times, said that was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made in his life. But that stuck. It lasted up until the 70s, because when I went to work at the training center, I used to have to meet with a lot of the assistant attorney generals, and they were just beginning to look at some of these cases there. And most of the young lawyers I talked to said that the extent of their knowledge was 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, and they felt that ended it right there. Very, very unfortunate. That law was repealed in 1974. It took that long for it to be repealed. As a matter of fact, when I went to work at the training center in 1972, you always get involved in situations that you look back at. Being a young social worker there at that particular time, I sat on a sterilization committee. It was real. I don't think it happened at that time, but it had been put in process. And institutions being institutions, once something was put in process, it kept on going up until 1974. This program, how could anyone disagree with eugenics? Eugenics was supported by Teddy Roosevelt, Margaret Sanger, Alexander Graham Bell. He was a famous proponent of eugenics. The Harvard and Yale universities, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, they all funded and supported eugenics. And I point out this was a nationwide effort coming out of Cold Springs in Long Island. They had a big, huge institute there where doctors and academics from all over the country would meet. But it was really fake science. It really was not based upon any medically sound principles. It was based on some remote theories of animal breeding and what happens to cows and horses and dogs and stuff like this, and they really felt it should be applied to humans on that, which was a pretty chilling thought. And I point out, sterilization does go on today, but it's for specific needs, specific necessity, and it's got legal safeguards all over the place. So if it's of necessity, there's really nothing wrong with it. But it's chilling to think that someone can come along without any judicial process and just take over take over people on a highly questionable basis. After the Supreme Court decision and so on, meanwhile, back at the training center, they had gone up to 700 people. And still, it was a pretty beneficial place to be, apart from the involuntary sterilization. Fresh air, a lot of good exercise, good food, and so on. But the training center very quickly became a victim of its own success. They were providing a good environment. They did have some good programs. And so the word got out, and as I mentioned earlier, people started flooding into the training center. The population began to grow. By 1939, there were 1,800 people, just in that short period of time. There were 400 people, however, they were on leave. And that's an interesting thing. Where were these 400 people? These 400 people had been farmed out. They worked on farms, or they were assigned as domestic servants in different homes. The women, as they were called, working girls. The men were working boys. Most of the apples here in Amherst County were picked by boys from the training center. They would go up there and stay with the family, or they'd get transportation there. And of course, they worked in a lot of other activities there. You think, well, why didn't it just go away? Why didn't it just leave? Well, when they came to the training center, they were committed. This was the legal situation. Anybody who came into any public institution was committed. If you were committed, whether to an insane asylum or the Western State Hospital or way back to the poorhouses, you had to go through a legal process. You couldn't just dance in there and say, I'm here. And once you went through that legal process, you could no longer make contracts. And what's a contract all about? Well, you will never make a contract with a minor, nor with a person who's suffering from mental illness. And so that immediately struck at that right. Along with that, couldn't vote, couldn't get married, couldn't get a driver's license here. There's a whole list of things that you could not do, which for some individuals, they thought, well, that's really inconsequential there. But also, you couldn't leave the organization that had control over you. If you did, you were put on escape. And so the state had the legal authority that if a young man or a young woman left the training center, the sheriff would go out and arrest them and bring them back. And that was a pretty serious thing there. So people could not leave because of their legal condition. Neither here nor there. A lot of individuals had no other place to go, but they legally could not leave because they were committed to the training center. Quick story. When I came back from overseas in the mid-'70s, I'd like to take the family camping, and we were camping up at Douthit State Park. And Sunday morning, there was a guy driving around in a car selling newspapers. And of course, I love Sunday newspaper. I have a hard time finding it today. But the guy came by, and we struck up a conversation. And he said he worked in, I think, Clifton Forge or Covington nearby. And he said he was doing this just to earn extra money. And he was driving there. And he asked me where was I from? And I said, I'm from Lynchburg. And his face just completely went blank. And he just all of a sudden said, oh my God, they're probably still looking for me on that. He had been there and he had just walked away. So here he is driving an automobile with a job in Covington, fearful that they were still going to come get him. Because at that particular point in time, they could have. They could have arrested him. Most of the localities didn't bother, but technically they could have. In 1939, the State Epileptic Colony, that was the name, the State Epileptic Colony, the name was changed to the Lynchburg State Colony. They left out the epileptic. It no longer was called an epileptic colony. And most people just knew it as the Lynchburg Colony. Interesting about the names, all the mental hospitals were state this or state that, Western State, Eastern State. They never said Williamsburg or Stanton. They were always a state hospital. But Lynchburg got the name right on the officially on the front, Lynchburg. And of course in Petersburg, it was a Petersburg State Hospital for African Americans back in those days. It wasn't up until the 60s that changed. But Lynchburg had the, I don't know how to say, distinction of having their name put right back up beside, a big hospital that served persons with disabilities, and that became quite controversial. During the 30s, they began to recognize that we need to do something more than just just have agricultural activities and preparing food and stuff. They began training programs. They started having some very basic schools, and they tried to teach individuals certain academic skills. They also had a lot of trade skills. The big thing then was shoe repair. Just like you'll find in a lot of other industries. And back in those days, if you were blind, you were going to be making brooms. And that's sort of sad. That was a sad reality of that era. But they began to have a little bit more compassionate idea. And right up until World War II, they were beginning to develop programs. But then when World War II came along, that upended everything. The doctors left. Most of the male staff were drafted. And so the place was basically deserted. Once again, who was running the training center? It was basically what they then called the high-grade individuals. The high-grade individuals were caring for the low-grade individuals. That was pretty much the classification at that time: high-grade, low-grade. And the low-grade, it could be individuals that had basic self-care needs, couldn't care for themselves, and the high-grade individuals were people that, of course, they were trapped there. They couldn't leave, and also they just had no other place to go. And so a lot of the doctors noticed that the patients seemed to know more about the hospital than the staff, which was probably a reality there. I know one time they always had a big carnival. They always had a big celebration every year. And one of the military units brought a big tent over there to use for some of the exhibits and such. And the soldiers there had no more idea than man in the moon how to put that tent up. They're pretty complicated. The old World War II tents are pretty complicated. So they dumped the thing in and said, what in the world are we going to do? But 4 or 5 guys from the training center, patients there, they marched up, had the tent up in just a few seconds here. And I knew firsthand how complicated that was. The services also were provided by not draft dodgers, but by conscientious objectors. And many times they could fulfill their military obligation by working in a hospital. So that was another way that the training center survived at that time. Right after World War II, the population grew to 2,000. That's a lot of people. They began to really experience overcrowding. They were building buildings like mad, and as soon as they built a new building, it was filled up, completely full. At that particular time, a lot of the buildings there, they were sleeping in shifts, particularly high-grade people there, when kind of like on a ship or a submarine. But when one guy had to get up and go to work, another guy came in and took his bed because it was that totally crowded. The buildings that they were building, this is the weird thing, none of the buildings had elevators, even though elevators were present there. So you think about the disabilities were increasing, particularly mobility. A lot of problems with ambulation there, but there were hardly any elevators anywhere. And some of the old buildings there, they had ramps, not stairs, but they had ramps. In the DeJarnett building, which is all the way at the end, I think that was built in some in the 20s or the 30s. It had ramps with big chain link type of separation between the stairwells. It was kind of an eerie thing there. And what's even eerie about it was 5 stories tall, full of women. And you can imagine what would have happened if a fire or something like that ever broke out. Yeah. The 1954, still getting overcrowded, but in 1954, the Lynchburg State Colony became the Lynchburg Training School and Hospital. It's 1954. They dropped the colony, but they kept the hospital and they kept the Lynchburg, and they stuck in training. So it was Lynchburg Training School and Hospital. The term hospital is interesting. In the Code of Virginia, hospital has a specific meaning. They're not in the Code of Virginia, which is 37.1 section. Code of Virginia, we're talking about Western State Hospital, Eastern State, and so on, and Lynchburg Training School and Hospital. That gave it certain legal authority, and I think that may have been connected not just to medical treatment, but that also because they were providing sterilization, that had to be done in a medical setting. So 1954, Lynchburg Training School and Hospital. The term at that time was patient. Hospital, patient. So that fit. When a new director came along, it was changed to resident. And of course, a lot of the staff got upset because they were used to calling everyone a patient. But the vast majority of the individuals were not medical patients. They did not have medical needs. They were disabled. They had care needs. During the 50s and 60s, training was emphasized. A lot of big buildings, and I say beautiful buildings there because if you look at a lot of the old buildings there, and then go look at Randolph-Macon Women's College, look at Virginia Baptist College, look at the Presbyterian Home, same guy built a lot of these buildings. The architecture, Stanhope Johnson, built a famous Lynchburg architect, built a lot of these buildings here. These were multi-level with hardly a thought for elevators there. And of course, in the 70s and the 80s there, we had spent tons and tons of money putting elevators in all these buildings here. And I often thought, what were they thinking? The Bradford building, which is the main hospital building, it's a gorgeous building. It is gorgeous. It's got the white woodwork and the brickwork and stuff like that. But and Thomas Jefferson would have been proud of the building. But as far as a functional building to care for people with significant disabilities, it was basically useless at that time. But the training center did make do. They used those buildings there, and they were quite overcrowded. 1954, the H. Minor Davis building was built. That was also built by Stanhope Johnson. The Davis building, you all remember the school building, had a huge auditorium, a gym in the bottom, and classrooms, full theatrical setup there that they could have plays and stuff like that. I don't think it was ever really used a whole lot for that, but it was built with the idea that anything that you need for the school, you're going to get. At that time, people still did not really know what are we going to do with all these individuals here, and they really didn't have the idea. No cures for this type of disability. The only thing was improvement or maximize abilities here. But one thing that they could do, and I'm not being cynical there, but they could put them in gorgeous, beautiful buildings, and looking from the outside, you'd feel better about it. And so that happened all over the country. If you go to New York, if you go to Pennsylvania and stuff like that, you go to some of the old institutions, they're gorgeous buildings, just fantastic buildings there. But you step inside, it's a whole totally different situation. In the 50s, the dairy and the farm were closed. A lot of people in Amherst got really upset about that, very, very upset. Because it said, why don't they have access to all this activity? And it'll keep everyone busy, and it can save the state money. Well, the reality was it didn't save the state money because you could buy the commodities cheaper on the market. It was much cheaper than the cost and effort to produce it. So it was a cost-saving factor. Didn't really put any of the patients, out of work there, but it did upset a lot of the local people there, because it was a cherished concept of self-sufficiency and independence. And of course, there were farms all over the country. There were agriculture. Western State Hospital, you can go there and you can still see the remnants of some of the old farm buildings there. The Western State Hospital, kind of to go back to that, is now on its third location. It wears out, it becomes unsuitable, and they build a new facility in different locations here. The original, and I had a lot of painful involvement with the original building. It looks like something out of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, but it's a beautiful, beautiful building. Now, this is what's kind of weird. If you're familiar with Stanton, go downtown. There's a lot of neat stuff. Downtown Stanton's being gentrified, and the old Western State Hospital is now a boutique hotel. Go figure. It's worth a visit. It's a boutique hotel on that. Probably take a little bit of money with you when you go there too. But here's a place that was used for a lunatic asylum. It was used as a state prison. Now it's a boutique hotel because it's got beautiful architecture. In 1957, Dr. Nagler, a lot of buildings over there named after Dr. Nagler. He was a very venerable psychiatrist, and I think he was from Germany. He was Jewish, and I think there was a bit of irony here. When he was there, sterilization was still being practiced, and we all know the very difficult association that Americans have with eugenics and with Germany. I don't need to go into that detail there, but Dr. Nagler was German, as a lot of our psychiatrists came from Eastern Europe and different places. After that, a lot of them came from Cuba. A lot of them came from Haiti and different other places, depending upon what was going on in the war. A large number of our nurses came from the Philippines, because when we were short, we would go overseas for staff. Bertha Core. Bertha Core is a wonderful, wonderful name. A dedicated nurse there. We have a building that was named after her. She grew up in the Oddfellows orphanage. In the 30s and the 40s, orphanages were prevalent. There were 3 in Lynchburg. And you better believe that if you go up in an orphanage, you have good work habits and you receive good training for that. She was a fantastic nurse. She ruled the training center with an iron hand. Dr. Nagler actually didn't have to do much of anything. He went off conferences most of the time in Europe and different places like that. And he was world renowned for his research. But Bertha Core, the nurse, at one time she was just one of 2 nurses there. It grew over time. And she was very protective, very possessive of her nurses on that. And they did not cross Bertha Core. And one day, one of the nurses came to work. They all wore uniforms back then, starch hats and everything. Came to work in a pantsuit, in a white pantsuit, and she was sent home immediately because Bertha Core did not want the nurses to be confused with food service workers, because food service workers wore white uniforms at that time, and the different specialties were very, very specific. Social workers and psychologists at that time wore coat and tie, and a long time before that broke down. The schools focused on basic skills, classrooms. Dr. Charles Wills was a principal there, and he dedicated a lot to setting up special what they call summer enrichment programs. They had a special program there for individuals with Down syndrome. Again, another term change. It used to be called Mongolism, and that was a very ugly term. We don't even use the term Down syndrome any longer, but at that time, Down syndrome was an automatic ticket to the training center, just an automatic ticket, and they, of course, many Down syndrome individuals are quite capable individuals there. They have some medical problems there. They have a short life expectancy, but we were amazed in in the 80s there, an individual with Down syndrome actually graduated from college on that. And that was just unheard of at that particular time. We did not admit anybody with autism because nobody knew what autism was at that time. This was back in the 70s and the 80s here. Autism was essentially a cold-hearted mother on that. That's what they thought created autism. There was an obsession with classifications, and when I was there, because it was so large, the main focus was on numbers. How many people here? How many people there? You really didn't have time to look at people as individual human beings. It was groups in huge numbers. How many people can you get in this building? The groupings, obviously you had the male, the female, you had the high grade, you had the low grade, you had nursery, little kids, because we were having infants that were being admitted. We had the adult development center for older people, sort of like a home for old folks here. And so they were grouped in different parts of the campus. We began to sort of specialize the campus. And believe it or not, we had an independent living center where about 100 people lived with no staff. In other words, they ran the place themselves. That was the old Smith Center down there. And that was built to be an independent. Because meantime, I'm thinking, what the devil were these people doing here to begin with on that? And that really did not occur to anyone until 1974. 1974 was one of the biggest changes that the training center had, and that's where a guy, Dr. Nelson, came along. I haven't talked to him for years and years, and I don't know if he's still around or not, so I can say things about him right now. But Dr. Nelson was sort of a Rasputin-type personality, a magical charm, and who brought about tremendous changes to the training center. He was extremely controversial. Don Pendleton, a lot of you remember Don Pendleton, went to war with Ray Nelson because he was upsetting the work schedules. He was upsetting the characterization of a lot of the clients there, and he just seemed to enjoy controversy. But he brought about some of the most important changes by reorganizing the training center from a strictly custodial medical model to a developmental model. In other words, everything that happens here is going to be towards developing the skills, developing the abilities, not just keep them in place, which is basically what he was doing. So when he got there were about 2,000 people. The crowding was horrible. The state told him, you can't admit people any longer, that you're over census, that you've got to do something to reduce the census. Several of the things that we did, and we did some pretty wild things here, we rented Father Judge Seminary for 2 years. For 2 years, the training center ran Father Judge Seminary because of the overcrowding. There's a beautiful picture there on the table. We converted one of the dairy barns into a dormitory. Sounds pretty grim, but the crowding was that bad. And of course, it was a beautiful, beautiful building on that. I had to do a lot of work on the inside, but the overcrowding was so horrible. And even though the state said you cannot admit any more people, there were still people coming in. And I know the admissions coordinator, phone would ring in the middle of the night, say it's a politician on the line, you are going to admit somebody, at this particular time. So from that point on, there was sort of that dichotomy between you're overcrowded, what are you going to do about it? But you got to admit these people because they really need to come into the training center. That was a horrible situation in the 80s and the 90s that pretty much existed. We introduced what was called the unit system. Rather than just having one big massive institution, we broke it down into different groups, and this really upset the social workers and psychologists and some of the nurses. Said you're no longer in the nursing department, you're no longer in the psychology department, you're going to go out to a team. And so they organized teams, a specialist, to work with individuals who had specific needs. Had a team that worked with the real younger, the nursery group, with medical developmental needs. We had a team that went to the independent living center, and because their programs were focused on independence. A team that went to the multi-handicapped. These were individuals that had a lot of ambulation problems there, a lot of spasticity problems there. And so they got out of their office and went out into teams. That upset a lot of people, really. That changed the whole tone of what was going on. Ray Nelson was also the guy that broke open the whole sterilization controversy. Like I said, that had been going on all along. It was, beneath the surface, and no one really thought anything about it there. Ray Nelson found Emma Buck and her sister living in Charlottesville, and he interviewed them, and he wrote a book, along with Paul Lombardi from the University of Virginia. He wrote a book. I forget the title, and I wish I could have gotten a copy of it, on the sterilization process. That book was a bombshell. The people in Richmond got a hold of that book, and they thought, what in the world has been going on at Lynchburg? And so there were all kinds of investigations, there were all kinds of reviews, and the state realized that they had better start to backpedal some of these things that had been going on all the time. And so that's when they sent the attorneys there to meet and to look at the records. And of course, an institution being an institution, the institution kept damn good records. Guess what? And so a couple of the attorneys I met with said, Rob, why the hell did y'all get rid of these records on that? Because now we've got to explain what's been going on all this time here. And of course, human rights was just beginning to stick its head up at that time. Human rights was not really a big issue in the 50s and the 60s, in the early 60s. But in the 60s and the 70s, human rights came full bore, along with side by side with civil rights, women's rights, African American rights, and so on. It was sort of rights of the handicapped. Prior to that time, a handicapped person really was sort of a non-entity, just something you just have to deal with. But Ray Nelson, he also made another dramatic announcement. He said, the people here at the training center have rights just like anybody in the community. And they can get a driver's license, they can vote, and then of course the real kicker was if they're able to, they can get married. That really upset people. Now, before anyone gets too upset, that very rarely ever happened. Very rarely ever happened. But like I said earlier, a lot of individuals could get driver's licenses, and of course we did initiate probably the most innocuous part of it there. We did initiate a big voting campaign. I don't know, how much impact that had on the individual there. But it made society feel better that we were now protecting those rights. Another big change was the change in the legal system. I said earlier, Code of Virginia, 37 point something another, the commitment laws, and if you were committed, that was it. And the only way you could get out of it was to be certified as improved. And if you're mentally ill, a psychiatrist could say, okay, he's not mentally ill any longer and he's improved. But if you're mentally retarded, on that, mental retardation is essentially forever. It just, you maximize what you got. And so a lot of people had trouble with I'm not going to say he's improved on that. And so the lawyers had to go back to work there, and they came up with a situation which said that anybody admitted to the training center would no longer be committed, but they would be certified. That was judicial certification. Judicial certification was a legal term which meant that there was no other alternative for this person in the community. That they couldn't go to a group home, because group homes didn't exist at that time. And a lot of families just couldn't care. So it just something certified. A judge certified that there were no other alternatives here. But it got out from under this stripping away their total rights. It was totally voluntary. A family could remove an individual at any time. The person could get up and walk out of there at any time. By that time, we weren't admitting people that were capable of getting up and walking out of there on that. And so their presence was pretty good. I guess one of the biggest changes that I saw there was the introduction of Medicaid. Because people with hard luck, people in a bad situation, used to be a poorhouse. That got kicked up to a state hospital. And that was state funding. I used to go to meetings in Richmond where the administrators would brag. They would brag about how little they had to spend per patient, and how economical they were. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this could be not so much a compliment to the care if you minimize your spending. when Medicaid came along, we had funding like we've never had before. We were able to recruit staff. We were able to develop programs that that the state budget would never allow. In other words, it was federal funding, and that opened up a whole different era of programs there. Staffing size increased tremendously. At that particular time, we also introduced another novel idea of, do these individuals have to stay here all their life? Is there a place in the community that they can go to, particularly if they're from Winchester, or if they're from Danville or Bristol or something? Families, even if the families wanted to, they could not visit because of the distances. And so the idea of, would it be nicer if this person was closer to where their family, where they came from? And now, again, not to be cynical, but a lot of families actually did care for their family members that were there. I worked with a lot of different families, and you can imagine the gut-wrenching realization that their son or daughter was not going to develop the way that their brothers and sisters or their cousins might develop, and it was pretty medically determined that was going to happen. And that was a gut-wrenching situation. And at one time, the training center back in the old days, they told families, don't come back. Leave them here, don't visit. Prior to World War II, that was pretty much accepted practice. It was hard for families to visit. It was hard for them to come over there because they had to go through all kinds of loopholes and stuff like that to get to visit their relative there. But with judicial certification, they could walk out of there any time they wanted to. That was a big change. Meanwhile, we had about 2,000 people. Ray Nelson, the guy that did a lot of these changes there, he used to brag about it was the largest mental retardation facility in the world. And I thought, Ray, that's not a real claim to fame there. But he would go to meetings and conferences. He was an extremely talented individual, a very forceful individual, but he had a big ego on it. And a lot of people in these positions had big egos, and a lot of the superintendents would compete with each other to see who could develop certain programs quicker than the other one. After Ray Nelson, another dramatic change came. The next director was Jennifer Fedora, female. That was dramatic. That really upset a lot of people. This was back in the early 80s there, and a lot of the hospitals thought only a male could have it. And God forbid she did not have a PhD. She was not an MD and she was not a PhD. That was a dramatic change. And she was a very diminutive individual, about 100 pounds soaking wet. That's probably a sexist comment there. But she was probably the most effective director that the facility had in terms of bringing a change out of Ray Nelson's beneficial chaos. And I say his chaos was beneficial because he shook up the system and caused a lot of these changes. And she kind of set the ship right, and we started on really good programs. We started on a real meaningful downsizing program, and at that time the handwriting was kind of on the wall that institutions were fading as a primary source of care. Anybody who didn't see that wasn't reading the trends and looking at it. In the meantime, we were having a really hard time getting staff. We were having a hard time reducing the census, and the obsession was, if you go over census, you're going to lose your Medicaid funding. And so we were always juggling back and forth. But by the way, there are 5 people here from Danville that you got to admit. So there was always that catch-22 dilemma that we were in. At that time, Chapter 10 boards, I don't know if you've heard of Chapter 10s, that was Chapter 10, the Code of Virginia, that organized the development of community services boards. Here in Lynchburg, it's called Horizons. Horizons is one of the oldest. I'm on the board of Horizons at the present time, and it's very, very meaningful to see those programs develop. I helped develop one of the first group homes back in the, I guess in the late 70s. Then it was called a halfway house. Later on, group homes, so halfway to what? That really did not make a lot of sense at that time. But it was sort of modeled after what happens when you leave prisons or when you leave certain other places, a halfway house. Uh, the changes that have occurred after that was the gradual diminishment of the training center. A lot of controversy there. As you know, Amherst has had problems getting that property because the state, in its lack of foresight, was spending money building buildings even when they knew the place was going to close. The 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 buildings, what we used to call the Child Development Center, was refurbished with high-tech equipment. They just ripped everything out, and they spent, I believe it was $25 million to refurbish it. Sometime, I think in the late 90s or the early 2000s, I don't know the dates. I wasn't there. It must have been the early 2000s. But they spent tons and tons of money on places that could be closed. You know, where has that ever happened before? When I was overseas, I was leaving a base there that we knew was going to close because we were moving out of that area. We knew it was going to close, but yet the Navy was building a new nursery for the families there, a place that was going to close in 2 years. So that's the government. You know, I don't mean disparagingly, but they'll let a contract. They'll get the money based upon a need. The need was 5 or 10 years ago. The money was 10 or 12 years down the road, and by the time the actual building got there, the need had gone away. And that's what happened at the training center. And that's why it was just fantastic when the state finally, I think the term is they defeased the $25 million so that Amherst could take it on. Because I don't think Amherst would have touched it with a $25 million debt hanging around. And the state had this crazy idea that whoever bought that place was going to inherit that debt. And that just didn't make sense at all. Just about finished. The training center right now is history. It's a big part of Amherst County, but it's part of a lot of stuff that was going on in the United States there. And you think, well, yeah, is it completely gone? We still got the cemetery over there. I want to go back over there sometime and visit. I visited the grave of Emma Buck of the Buck versus Bell Supreme Court. She's buried there. You know, the acreage, when driving here today, if you drive across the Monacan Bridge, if you're driving over the land that the men farmed there with horses and stuff like that. If you look real hard to your left, you can see the two water towers. The training center had about 3 or 4 water towers. The training center actually had a railroad line that ran up to right below the main administration building where the power plant was. The power plant was for the entire campus, underwater steam lines on there. Impossible to maintain nowadays, but it's all still there. But it's really kind of has an important legacy. I think a lot of the buildings are going to go on that. I hope that some of them will be kept there. Sort of a monument, but you think a monument to what? The training center does have a legacy, and the legacy is we trained most of the teachers at Lynchburg College. Most of the special ed teachers were trained at the training center, and so there's the legacy. Most of the group homes, DePaul's, Cabinets, and there's a host of group homes right now, became small operations there, and they were employees of the training center. They set up the group homes there. So the training center is, in a way, alive and well. It still exists in that legacy. The buildings didn't go anywhere, but as I hope that I've indicated, buildings are meaningless unless you have a really relevant program, something that's relevant to the time,